She held the key to the most guarded room inside the world headquarters of the Jehovah's Witnesses. She wasn't an intruder. She wasn't a journalist. She wasn't a critic looking for a story. She was their hand-picked historian, sitting alone in an archive in Brooklyn, with permission to open a filing cabinet almost no one outside that building was ever allowed to touch. What she expected to find was history. Old letters. Faded correspondence. Statistics for a legal report. What she actually found was a pattern of silence stretching back decades. A pattern so consistent, so methodical, so clearly written into the policy of the organization that the moment she understood what she was looking at, her life as a Jehovah's Witness was over. She just didn't know it yet. For 43 years, Barbara Anderson had been the ultimate insider. She was baptized into the faith in 1954, when she was a young woman. She married a man who would later be appointed as an elder. She raised a son inside the religion. And in 1982, she and her husband Joe reached the highest spiritual achievement available to an ordinary witness. They were invited to live and work at Bethel, the global nerve center of the faith. She was trusted. She was loyal. She was given documents no one else was allowed to see. But in the early 1990s, she was asked to organize a specific set of records. Records the legal department wanted reviewed. Records dealing with internal misconduct involving minors inside the organization. What she found in those files, and what she eventually decided to do with them, would put her on national television in the United States, get her permanently cut off from her own son and her own grandson, and trigger the single largest documentation scandal in the history of the Watchtower. This is the story of the woman they wish they had never hired. And halfway through this video, we are going to reveal the exact one-sentence policy the leadership used to make thousands of internal cases disappear into a filing cabinet. A policy still being applied today. Once you see it written down in plain language, the last 40 years of silence finally make sense. So stay with me, because that single rule is the key to everything that follows. Part 1. The Model Citizen. Barbara Anderson was not a rebel. She was not a doubter. She was not the kind of person who whispered questions to her husband on the drive home from the Kingdom Hall. She was a true believer. From 1954 onward, her entire identity was the organization, the friends, the schedule, the vocabulary, the clothing, the expectations, the promise of a paradise on earth that was always just around the corner. Every major decision in her adult life had been filtered through one question. What does Jehovah's organization want me to do? In 1982, she and Joe reached what most committed witnesses considered the spiritual pinnacle. They were invited to live and work at Bethel in Brooklyn, New York. To understand the weight of that, you have to understand what Bethel was at the time. Picture a sovereign city inside a city. Dormitories, dining halls, massive printing presses running day and night, pushing out magazines in dozens of languages, offices, legal departments, translation departments, a writing department where every word of every publication was scrutinized before it reached the millions of witnesses around the world. You did not get to Bethel by accident. You got there by invitation. You gave up your home, your career, your savings, sometimes your retirement plans. You did not own property. You did not build wealth on the outside. In exchange, the organization provided everything. Your room, your meals, a small monthly allowance, a sense of purpose, and the unspoken promise that your security in this life and in the resurrection to come was tied to those walls. For people like Barbara and Joe, that trade made perfect sense. They believed. They were inside. Barbara was assigned to the research wing for the writing department. Her job, for 11 years, was to provide the facts that other people turned into the magazine's millions of witnesses read. If a paragraph in the Watchtower made a claim about history, about science, about another religion, about a court case, there was a very good chance someone like Barbara had pulled the source material that made that paragraph possible. She was good at the work. She was thorough. She was trusted. And because she was trusted, in the early 1990s she was chosen for a prestige assignment. The organization was preparing a definitive, commemorative history of itself. A polished, hardcover volume that would be released in 1993 under the title Jehovah's Witnesses, Proclaimers of God's Kingdom. The kind of book that would sit on every witness's shelf for the next generation. The kind of book that would shape how the faith told its own story to its own people. Barbara's role in that project gave her something the organization had never quite intended to hand out. Call it a golden ticket. Total access to decades of internal correspondence. Legal memos. Letters from elders all over the United States writing to the headquarters with questions about how to handle problems inside their local congregations. Old files. Old reports. The kind of paperwork most ordinary witnesses did not even know existed. This is the part of her story that matters most. Barbara Anderson did not find what she found on the internet. She did not find it in a book by a critic. She did not find it from an angry ex-member trying to recruit her. She found it inside their own filing cabinets, in their own handwriting, in their own institutional voice. And once she started reading, really reading, the foundation of her 43 years of belief began to shift under her feet. Now, before we get to what those files actually contained, hold on to one thing. Because in part 3, I'm going to show you the one-sentence policy that explains why all of this stayed hidden for so long. It is not the kind of rule most outsiders know about. But once you see it, you will understand why a researcher inside that archive could not, in good conscience, close the drawer and walk away. Part 2. The reproach factor. The assignment seemed routine at first. The legal department wanted statistics. They wanted a sense of how many cases of internal misconduct involving minors the organization had on file across its congregations in the United States. They wanted Barbara to pull the records and organize them. So she did. She began with the assumption that she was going to find a small folder. A handful of historical incidents from a previous era. Maybe a few dozen cases stretched across decades. The kind of thing every large institution unfortunately accumulates. What she actually pulled out of those cabinets was a mountain. Reports from elders. Hundreds of them. Letters describing serious crimes committed against children inside the faith. The names attached to those reports were not the names she expected. These were not random outsiders who had somehow slipped into the congregation. These were people in high standing. Appointed elders. Ministerial servants. Full-time pioneers. Long-serving Bible study conductors. Men with reputations. Men with status. Men whose families were respected. Men who sat near the front of the Kingdom Hall. The names were not the shock. The shock was the responses from headquarters. Letter after letter, decade after decade, the instruction sent back to the local elders was the same. Do not involve the police unless the local law specifically requires it. Handle the matter internally. Convene a judicial committee, a private tribunal held in a back room of the Kingdom Hall, behind closed doors, with no outside oversight. Keep the proceeding confidential. Do not announce the underlying allegation to the congregation. Do not warn the other families. In short, keep it quiet. And as Barbara read more of these letters, she began to notice a single word appearing again and again. A word that, once you start looking for it, you cannot stop seeing. The word was reproach. In ordinary English, reproach means shame, disgrace, public criticism. Inside the internal language of the Watchtower, it meant something more specific. It meant the risk that the outside world would see something ugly inside the faith and use it against the work of preaching. It meant scandal. It meant bad press. It meant a stain on Jehovah's name and on the reputation of the organization that claimed to represent him. The instruction across these documents was clear. Avoid reproach. Protect the name. Do not let the matter become known outside. To Barbara, sitting alone in that archive, the implication was inescapable. Somewhere along the way, protecting the institution's reputation had become almost indistinguishable from protecting the people who had harmed children inside it. Because in case after case, when the choice came down to a child's safety or the organization's public image, the documentation she was holding showed the leadership choosing the image. She was not reading allegations. She was reading admissions. The men at the top had known. They had been answering letters about this kind of thing for decades. They had developed standardized responses. They had created a procedure. They had built a system. And the system was working exactly as it had been designed to work. That realization changed the nature of what Barbara was looking at. She was no longer a researcher reviewing historical material for a book project. She had become, without intending to, a witness to a pattern. A pattern that depended completely on a single piece of ancient doctrine being applied in the most rigid possible way. That doctrine was the lock on the entire system. And it has a name. Part 3. The Mechanical Silence. To understand why those files stayed buried, you have to understand the rule. One verse. One interpretation. One procedural standard. It is called the two-witness rule. The verse is Deuteronomy 19 verse 15. In its plainest reading, the passage says that no one should be condemned on the testimony of a single witness, and that any serious matter should be established at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. For most religious traditions, this verse is treated as a general principle of fairness. Don't convict people on a single accusation. Look for corroboration. Take serious claims seriously. Apply judgment carefully. That is the spirit in which most readers, religious or not, would understand the words. Inside the Jehovah's Witnesses, the rule became something far more rigid. Across decades of letters, policy memos, and elder training materials, it was formalized into a procedural standard with one very specific application. The policy was this. In order for a judicial committee to take action against an accused member, that is, in order to formally discipline him, strip him of privileges, or remove him from the congregation, there had to be at least 2 witnesses to the act itself. Read that again. Not 2 witnesses to a pattern of behavior. Not 2 separate victims describing similar incidents. Not corroborating physical evidence. Not medical reports. Not photographs. Not a written confession to a third party. Not the testimony of a counselor. 2 physical witnesses to the specific act. Now think about the math of that. Serious crimes against children are, by their nature, private. They happen behind closed doors. They happen when no other adult is in the room. They happen in the dark. The privacy of the act is not incidental to what makes the crime possible. It is the precondition of it. By demanding 2 physical eyewitnesses to the act itself, the leadership had created a standard that, in the real world, was almost impossible to meet. If a child came forward, the case began with one witness, the child. If a parent reported what their son or daughter had told them, that was hearsay. Not a second witness. If a therapist documented the trauma, that was professional opinion. Not a second witness. If a sibling described seeing the accused leave the room with the victim, that was suspicious. Not a second witness. In nearly every real case the elders were asked to handle, there was only ever one witness in the strict sense the policy required. The child. And under the rule, that was not enough. If the accused denied the allegation, and almost all of them did, the committee was, by procedure, instructed not to take action. The case was closed. The accused remained a member in good standing. He could continue to attend meetings. He could continue to hold his appointment. He could continue to sit in a hall full of other families' children. He could be welcomed into other people's homes for Bible study, for dinner, for the kind of personal contact that gave him access to more victims. The actual victim, meanwhile, was given a very different instruction. She was told to leave the matter in Jehovah's hands, to trust that God himself would judge the wrongdoer in his own time, to avoid taking the matter to outside authorities, because doing so might bring reproach upon the congregation. Sit with that for a moment. The person who had been harmed was the one expected to stay silent. The person who had done the harm was the one protected by the procedure. This was not an oversight. It was not a clerical error. It was not a single rogue elder misapplying a guideline. It was the policy. Written down, trained, repeated, applied in congregation after congregation, country after country, decade after decade. Barbara Anderson, sitting in that archive in Brooklyn, was the first insider with the access, the inclination, and the documentation to see the full mechanism laid out in front of her at the same time. The doctrine, the procedure, the reproach argument, the instruction not to involve the authorities, the standardized language used to send victims home. She had found the engine, the procedural wall that made the invisible stay invisible. Now she had to decide what to do about it. Part 4. The Trade. The first thing Barbara did was the thing any loyal insider would do. She tried to fix it from inside. She and Joe wrote letters. They raised concerns through proper channels. They appealed to the sober, suited men at the top of the organization. They believed, in the beginning, that the leadership simply did not understand the full scale of what was sitting in their own filing cabinets. They believed that if the right people saw the numbers, the policy would change. That reasonable men, presented with evidence, would do what evidence demands. She was wrong. They knew. They had always known. They were the ones who had written the policy in the first place. They were the ones answering those decades of letters. The reason the system existed the way it existed was that they wanted it to exist that way. The reason the rule had not changed was that they did not want it to change. By the late 1990s, Barbara had stopped writing letters. She had stopped trying to reform the institution from the inside. She had begun, quietly and privately, helping the victims who had started to find her through whisper networks. People reached out. Survivors wrote to her. Their stories kept matching the pattern she had documented inside the archive. In the year 2000, a former elder from Kentucky named Bill Bowen made a decision that would intersect with her own. Bowen had served as a presiding overseer in his congregation. He had become aware of a known wrongdoer being allowed to remain in the community despite credible accusations. He had pushed for action. He had been overruled. He had resigned. And he had founded a public advocacy group called Silent Lambs, dedicated to giving voice to the victims of the Watchtower's internal handling of these cases. Barbara and Bill found each other. And together, in 2002, Barbara made the choice that, for someone with 43 years of conditioning inside that organization, was almost unimaginable. She went outside. She went to Dateline NBC. In May of 2002, the American news program aired a long-form investigative segment titled Silent No More. Barbara Anderson sat in front of a national camera and, for the first time, the world outside the Jehovah's Witnesses heard the story from an insider with archival access. She named the doctrine. She described the files. She walked viewers through what she had read inside those filing cabinets. She explained the two-witness rule. She explained the reproach argument. She explained the instruction to keep matters internal. She showed America that the pattern of silence inside the organization was not the result of a few bad apples in remote congregations. It was a written policy, applied consistently from the top. For a religion built on the principle that loyal members do not appear in worldly media to criticize the faith, that broadcast was a catastrophe. The men at the top did not respond by announcing a policy review. They did not commission an independent investigation. They did not issue a public apology to the victims who had spent years trying to be heard. They did not, in any meaningful sense, change. They moved against Barbara. Within months, she was charged internally with apostasy, the single most serious offense a Jehovah's Witness can be accused of. She was disfellowshipped. Her husband Joe, who responded by writing a letter asking how his wife had been treated, was disfellowshipped shortly after. And then the second mechanism kicked in. The one that hurt more than any policy fight. The shunning. To outsiders, shunning sounds like a quaint old word. A strained Christmas dinner. An awkward silence at a family gathering. Inside the Jehovah's Witnesses, it is a complete social erasure. The announcement is made publicly, from a platform, in front of an entire congregation. Every active witness, every friend, every neighbor, every relative still in the faith, is instructed to cease all unnecessary contact with the person who has been removed. The instruction is treated as a direct expression of loyalty to God. For Barbara and Joe, the cost was not abstract. It was their son. It was their daughter-in-law. It was the 3-year-old grandchild they had been told they were no longer allowed to see. 40 years of friendships vanished in weeks. People who had been at their wedding crossed the street to avoid eye contact. The community Barbara had been part of since she was a teenager closed around her and erased her from the inside. She had traded her family. She had traded her social world. She had traded the only life she had ever known. In exchange, the truth she had pulled out of that filing cabinet would not go back inside. Most people would have broken. Most people, after losing access to their own grandchild, after watching 40 years of relationships disappear in a single weekend, would have gone quiet. They would have taken the loss, lowered their head, and faded into a private life somewhere far away from the religion that had erased them. There would have been no shame in that. Barbara did the opposite. She doubled down. She spent the next 20 years of her life building one of the largest publicly accessible archives of leaked internal Watchtower material anywhere in the world. She called the project Watchtower documents, memos, policy letters, legal filings, court records, elder training manuals, field reports. If a piece of paperwork from inside the organization made it into the outside world, there was a very good chance Barbara Anderson eventually had a scanned copy of it on her website. She gave interviews to journalists. She corresponded with attorneys representing survivors. She talked to researchers writing books. She answered messages from current witnesses who were beginning to ask their own quiet questions. And she gave them, in many cases, the first honest answer they had ever received from anyone with insider credibility. And then, slowly, the dam she had helped crack began to give way somewhere far larger than American cable television. In 2015 and 2016, the Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse opened a formal investigation into the Jehovah's Witnesses. It became known as Case Study 54. The commission examined the same two-witness rule, the same internal handling procedures, the same pattern of unreported cases. The commission's findings landed with the weight of an official state inquiry. They documented more than 1,000 alleged perpetrators inside the Australian branch alone, going back several decades. According to the commission's report, not one of them had been reported to the police by the religious leadership. Not one. The two-witness rule was now being scrutinized on a global stage. Not in a Brooklyn archive read by one researcher. Not in a private letter to elders. Not in an American news segment that aired and faded. In the formal record of a government investigation, with full legal weight. Barbara's name was not on the cover of that report. The investigators did their own work, gathered their own testimony, drew their own conclusions. But the pathway that made that level of public scrutiny possible, the long, slow process of turning the abuse story from a fringe accusation into a mainstream, documented historical fact, had been built, brick by people like Barbara Anderson and Bill Bowen, who decided years earlier that silence was no longer acceptable. What she had started alone in a filing cabinet ended up shaping the historical record of an entire religion. Barbara Anderson did not set out to be an enemy of the faith. She did not start as an activist. She did not have a grievance she was trying to settle. She was a researcher who did her job too well. She was given access to records the leadership did not expect her to actually read with her conscience switched on. And she refused to close the drawer. For 43 years, Barbara Anderson was the model of what the organization said a faithful witness should be. A baptized member from her teenage years. A wife of an elder. A mother who raised her son inside the religion. A volunteer at the global headquarters. A researcher trusted with the most prestigious history project the faith had ever produced. She believed. What changed her was not a critic, not the internet, not a personal grievance. It was the words on the pages inside her own institution, the letters her own leaders had written, the policy her own organization had created, the procedural wall her own faith had built around the people who had hurt the most vulnerable members of its own congregations. She could have closed the drawer. She could have written the report her superiors wanted. She could have kept her status. She could have kept her home. She could have kept her seat in the Kingdom Hall. She could have kept her son. She could have kept her grandson. All she had to do was look away. She chose otherwise. The cost of that choice followed her for the rest of her life. The friendships she lost did not come back. The grandchild she was barred from seeing grew up without her in his early years. The community that had been her entire world from the age of 19 continued, decade after decade, to treat her as if she had never existed. She knew when she walked onto that television set in 2002 exactly what it was going to take from her. And she walked on anyway. But the record she pulled into the light cannot be put back into the dark. The testimony she gave on national television cannot be unsaid. The archive she built kept growing. The royal commissions and parliamentary inquiries that followed kept asking the questions she had been asking on her own, alone, since the early 1990s. A faithful researcher walked into an archive and found something her religion did not want her to find. That is the whole story, in one sentence. Everything else is what happens, on either side of that moment, when one person decides not to look away. The question this story leaves you with is the one Barbara herself had to answer. If you had been standing in that archive, holding that key, watching the contents of those files slowly assemble themselves into a pattern in front of you, would you have opened the next drawer, or would you have walked out and forgotten what you saw? Would you have kept the family, the home, the friends, the standing? Or would you have made the trade she made? Most of us will never know what we would do until the moment is in front of us. Barbara Anderson knew, and she answered with the rest of her life. If this story moved you, the most important thing you can do is keep this kind of investigation alive. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. Leave a comment below telling us, do you think Barbara made the right choice? Would you have done the same in her place? We read every comment, and your voice is what tells the algorithm this work matters. If you know someone who needs to see this story, share the video with them. There are still families inside the organization living with the consequences of the policy you just learned about. The more people who understand how it actually works, the harder it becomes to keep the next filing cabinet closed. See you in the next one.